It's an interesting question and quite a large one. So migrants play many roles in receiving societies. In the labor market, young migrants who migrate with their parents are also important members of the schooling community, and as you know, they have lots of jobs. I would say, what are the differences between migrants and the native population? Everything and nothing. So they come with unique experiences, unique language skills, different identities, different places of socialization. They come with different qualifications. Sometimes this means that they struggle in the labor market or they struggle in school, but sometimes it can give distinct advantages as well. So at least in the UK, you tend to see something of a bifurcated distribution with lots of immigrants doing very well at the top of the distribution and also some immigrants doing not so well at the bottom. That tends to be what you see in the UK. That's also a good question. So usually you see a lot of change from the second generation from the first. So often if the first generation parents are not very well educated, you see a lot of catch-up usually in the second generation. So there's a lot less diversity, actually. There's a lot less variation in educational qualifications in the second generation than in the first. And you also see I know you're interested in identity, you see identificational changes as well. So very few first-generation immigrants will espouse an identity that is completely of the receiving country. It's usually hyphenated or something, so I am American, British, etc. By the second generation, certainly in the United States, over 90% of the second generation identify as some form of an American identity, and you see similar in the UK as well, with most second gen identifying as some sort of British. So you see a lot of interesting differences in identification depending on when the children of immigrants arrived. So if you come at a young age, or if they're born in the receiving country, obviously they have the same sort of feelings that they have the same kinds of rights as they do as receiving country natives, that they feel usually they're native speakers, they are very familiar with and comfortable in all the receiving country institutions, and all these things really help to create a strong identity of being of the receiving country. But then there's also the fact that their parents were socialized someplace elsewhere. Maybe they have an accent, maybe they have different skin color, different religion, and this can create feelings of otherness. Some scholars think that this can actually be a form of strength. It's called cultural hybridity. So this ability to be a master in multiple cultures can actually be a source of that kind of identification can be a source of strength, like good mental health. Other scholars find that it can be a source of strain, so role strain or identity strain is also an issue. A lot of it depends on the individual themselves. Scholars think that cultural hybridity can be a strength because you're able to draw on the strengths of more than one cultural. So you have a variety of cultural repertoire. For instance, I'm thinking specifically of, I have a lot of work on immigrants in the United States, so maybe cultural traditions surrounding longer time spent doing homework, people who are more likely to have two parents in the labor market, people who are more likely to have strong feelings of family obligation. This can be a source of strength when it comes to educational performance, for instance. So having that identity and that set of values can be a source of strength. At the same time, you're comfortable with the receiving country, and so you're familiar with the norms and ways of doing things in, say, the American school system, for instance, or the British school system. So knowing more, having more more intercultural toolkit to draw from can be a source of strength. So they tend, by being of the receiving country and the sending country and consuming cultural products in the sending and receiving country and having both languages, having social ties. So often children of immigrants still have close social ties to family members back home. That creates links that wouldn't exist otherwise. So I think immigrants, in some sense, are quite normal. Right now in the UK, I think it's 1 in 5 children being born today have at least one immigrant parent. So this group of second generation will only be more important in the UK. There are already large numbers in the United States, across Western Europe. So I think this will become the new normal, actually, in many receiving countries.
from the...
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, again, scholars find that it gives you advantages because you have a wider range of cultural tools to draw from for educational or occupational success. There's also some literature that shows that it can create feelings of foreignness or feelings of not belonging. There's also very real experiences with discrimination and racism that many immigrants and their children face in receiving societies. That also presents challenges. So I think there's some sources of strength, but there can also be challenges and challenges to overcome as well. Well, there's a couple things you've said that I find really interesting. One is that the salience of your identity can vary across different social contexts. So yes, when you're with your family, you feel Chinese. When you're with your mates in the pub, you feel British. And that this is something that you see a lot. This is true of everybody, but you definitely see a lot with second gen. And again, this can be a source of strength, this ability to sort of be like a fish in water. You can move in different places and sort of play different roles. This also even happens even with language. So we know that the children of immigrants can code switch, can go from one language to another very fluidly, and that's quite a strength. But then I suppose, yes, it can also be a challenge when people maybe are also challenging you on your Britishness, as you say, well, I'm British, but where are you really from? So this is these kinds of microaggressions of feeling like you don't belong. Sometimes I hear students or also people I interview, well, I was in a social situation and someone asked me, where am I from? Well, I was born here. And then having this, people not believing that you're actually British or that you're actually American because of the way you look is troubling and makes you feel unhappy. And I think that's challenging for many people, yes.
Would you...
I imagine it has pluses and minuses. I think, again, I do think that there's many sources of strength there. And I think, especially, like you said before, as we're entering into a more global world, it's beneficial to be able to feel comfortable in different cultural contexts. That's a strength. So yes, I think it probably is a good thing. Again, this is from research, not from personal experience. I have a colleague who studies this, and for instance, immigrants to the UK are very unlikely to identify as English. They are very likely to identify as British, and some of the reason why it can be difficult to identify as English is because that has an ethno-nationalistic connotation for many immigrants. To be British is to be cosmopolitan, is to be that's a more cosmopolitan identity. To be English means you were born and raised here for generations, and it also has racial connotations for many people as well. So I think what's interesting to me about the UK case is these regional identities can be much more exclusive than a national one is. Well, if we have the same idea of what deterritorialization means, so to me this means having social networks and having a life that can be lived across borders, that is not located in any specific territory, but which is more fluid and takes place across national borders. And I think absolutely that immigrants can lead lives like that, and especially with new technologies, it's easier to do that than it ever was before. So yes, I think that they do, but I do think that for the second generation that can be quite difficult. So you see very high rates of telephone calls, of visits, usually amongst the foreign-born going to the home country, but amongst their children it drops a lot, and a lot of that is because immigrant kids lose their language skills, and it's just also difficult. It takes resources and time and effort to maintain those ties, and by the second generation it already declines a lot. So some people do, but usually by the second generation it's much less than it was in the first.
Right.
I think it has both. In general, most migration scholars are pro-immigration, pro-immigrants. So yes, I think there's benefits. There's commercial benefits. You buy and sell things, new products come over. There's benefits in terms of new ideas. Innovation tends to happen in places where there's lots of immigrants. People have different ideas about things. They invent things there. There tend to be highly motivated people. So there's lots of benefits, I think, that comes from this deterritorialization. I struggle with that word myself, but I think that are good, yes. No, I think it's interesting too, and actually I have a colleague here at Essex, Yasmin Soysal, so she's doing a huge study of Chinese students in the UK actually, but a lot of it though is something that we call immigrant selectivity. So the average person who chooses to move from, say, China to the UK is different than the average Chinese person, because it's not like just random who comes here. It's a certain type of person who makes that move. And you're right, they tend to be different. They tend to have a different identity. Usually they're more cosmopolitan. They're usually better off on average because it takes resources to move. So a certain kind of person migrates, and immigrant selectivity might be part of why these identities form. It might not be because of living in the UK. It might just be that you were already different before you even left China. And the type of person who chooses to move is just the type of person who has a different type of identity or different ideas about things. So certainly in the UK, Brexit is massive. What's going to happen to EU migrants, their rights, their family reunification rights, their rights to work, that I think is a huge issue. Equally, whether or not we'll be able to replace EU migration with third country migration is also an interesting question, because in some ways Brexit presents opportunities for third country migrants who maybe couldn't have come now, maybe now will be recruiting more heavily from third non-European countries. So I think Brexit is probably the most pressing in what happens after Brexit. We still don't have a migration policy, really. We're still waiting for the new government to kind of put things into play. It's a fascinating time to be a migration scholar. So I would say Brexit I would also say, I've got lots of things to say, increasing nationalism, right-wing turns in many governments across the country, across Europe, across the world. Environmentally induced migration from war, forced migration. So these are all issues that the UK is not really facing yet, but will come here eventually. So there's Brexit, forced migration, right-wing governments. That's probably what I'd say.